All right, so picture this for a second. You're standing in ancient Rome, sun blazing, crowds buzzing, and right in the middle of all that chaos, a kid, barely a teenager, is being sold like he's nothing more than a luxury item. And not just any kid, one the Romans called a delicatus. That wasn't some cute nickname. That was a label that meant you were prized for your looks, your elegance, your refinement. But at the end of the day, you were still property, something to be bought, displayed, controlled. And here's where it gets absolutely unreal. These boys weren't sold in dark corners or hidden rooms. No, Rome put them right out in the open. Platforms in the Forum Barium, crowds shouting, price tags hanging around their necks like they were livestock. Some came from war-torn regions. Others were sold by desperate families who had nothing left. And to the elite on Palatine Hill, these kids were status symbols. The richer the Roman, the more refined the boy they owned. Juvenal, one of Rome's loudest critics, once joked that a curly-haired boy cost more than a farm. But honestly, it wasn't a joke. It was Rome flexing its wealth in the most brutal way possible. And just when you think it can't get darker, it does. Because for the boys who ended up inside the emperor's household, being owned wasn't enough. Rome demanded total control. Physical control, emotional control, even bodily control. Eunuchs, young men altered to fit the empire's tastes, became symbols of power, sitting just steps away from the emperor himself. They lived in marble halls, slept on golden couches, and still had zero agency over their own lives. Some, like Sporus, Nero's infamous favorite, were forced into roles so bizarre and disturbing that ancient writers struggled to explain them. Dressed as women, paraded as imperial spouses, used as props to showcase an emperor's dominance. So here's the real question. How did a civilization known for its architecture, philosophy, and law justify something this extreme? And what does it say about the true cost of Roman greatness? All right, so picture this for a second. You're standing in ancient Rome, sun blazing, crowds buzzing, and right in the middle of all that chaos, a kid, barely a teenager, is being sold like he's nothing more than a luxury item. And not just any kid, one the Romans called a delicatus. That wasn't some cute nickname. That was a label that meant you were prized for your looks, your elegance, your refinement. But at the end of the day, you were still property, something to be bought, displayed, controlled. And here's where it gets absolutely unreal. These boys weren't sold in dark corners or hidden rooms. No, Rome put them right out in the open. Platforms in the Forum Barium, crowds shouting, price tags hanging around their necks like they were livestock. Some came from war-torn regions. Others were sold by desperate families who had nothing left. And to the elite on Palatine Hill, these kids were status symbols. The richer the Roman, the more refined the boy they owned. Juvenal, one of Rome's loudest critics, once joked that a curly-haired boy cost more than a farm. But honestly, it wasn't a joke. It was Rome flexing its wealth in the most brutal way possible. And just when you think it can't get darker, it does. Because for the boys who ended up inside the emperor's household, being owned wasn't enough. Rome demanded total control. Physical control, emotional control, even bodily control. Eunuchs, young men altered to fit the empire's taste, became symbols of power, sitting just steps away from the emperor himself. They lived in marble halls, slept on golden couches, and still had zero agency over their own lives. Some, like Sporus, Nero's infamous favorite, were forced into roles so bizarre and disturbing that ancient writers struggled to explain them. Dressed as women, paraded as imperial spouses, used as props to showcase an emperor's dominance. So here's the real question. How did a civilization known for its architecture, philosophy, and law justify something this extreme? And what does it say about the true cost of Roman greatness? So picking up right where we left off, those boys who were purchased by wealthy Roman families already lived under constant control. But for the ones singled out for the emperor's household, everything intensified. Their daily reality wasn't just strict, it was engineered down to the smallest detail. Because inside the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, power operated on a whole different level. And for Rome's elite, owning someone wasn't the endgame. Total domination was. That's where eunuchs, known as spadones, come into the picture. These were enslaved boys and young men whose bodies were physically altered to match the empire's demands. And what makes this even crazier is that Rome supposedly hated the idea. Roman writers constantly mocked eunuchs as symbols of Eastern weakness or foreign softness. They'd talk trash about Parthia and Asia Minor for using them, yet Rome's own elite kept employing eunuchs behind closed doors. Total hypocrisy, plain and simple. And here's the wildest twist. Castration was technically illegal. The Lex Cornelia banned the practice. On paper, Rome said, "We don't do that." But in reality, enforcement was all over the place, especially when the elite were involved. If a powerful household wanted a certain look, if they wanted a boy with traits that never changed, whose appearance stayed refined, Rome found ways to pretend the law didn't exist. They just looked the other way. Historical records don't go into graphic detail about the procedure itself, but the silence says everything. It's like even Roman authors couldn't bring themselves to describe what was happening in those back rooms. Yet we know enough to understand what it represented. Absolute control. A permanent reminder that these boys were owned body and soul. They became symbols of loyalty, hierarchy, and obedience inside the palace. Not honored, not respected, just controlled. And the empire kept feeding this system. As Rome expanded, more enslaved boys were taken from regions like Cappadocia, Parthia, and Asia Minor. They were brought in quietly, rarely acknowledged openly, and absorbed into the machinery of imperial life. Their existence was essential to how the elite displayed power, even if nobody wanted to admit it. But here's where things start getting even darker, because life inside the emperor's inner circle wasn't just about control. It was about ritual, secrecy, and lives hidden in plain sight.
And this is where the entire story shifts from disturbing to downright haunting. Because once these boys were absorbed into the emperor's private world, they didn't just disappear from public life. They disappeared from themselves. Their names, their identities, their futures, all swallowed by the machinery of imperial power. They lived in the very heart of Rome, closer to the emperor than most senators, yet they barely registered as individuals in the historical record. They became shadows in marble halls. Sporus, probably the most infamous example. This wasn't some random boy in a distant villa. This was a youth pulled directly into Emperor Nero's inner circle. According to Suetonius, Nero didn't just claim ownership over him, he reshaped Sporus into a living symbol of his own control. Forced physical alteration, dressed in women's clothing, paraded publicly as Nero's wife. And to make it even more surreal, Nero renamed him Sabina, after his dead spouse. Think about that for a second. A boy turned into a theatrical replacement for an emperor's lost partner. And Sporus wasn't alone. Roman writers mention others: delicati, spado, pueri delicate, young enslaved males chosen for their appearance and forced into roles that blended performance, ritual, and servitude. These weren't jobs. These were identities crafted for someone else's satisfaction. And behind the luxury, it was brutal. The imperial court was packed with politics, paranoia, and non-stop power plays. These kids lived in rooms decorated with gold and marble, but every breath they took was monitored. One wrong step, one rumor, one whisper could end everything. Suetonius even claimed that Tiberius's villa on Capri became a place where disturbing stories circulated. Sure, ancient writers could be biased, but when multiple sources hint at the same patterns of exploitation, it paints a pretty clear picture. What makes their situation so tragic is the contradiction they were trapped in. They were visible enough to be displayed like trophies, but voiceless when it came to their own lives. They might sit beside an emperor at an event, yet couldn't make a single choice about their own future. Rome admired their refinement while completely ignoring their humanity. But hold up, because this next part exposes the real truth behind Rome's greatness, and it's going to hit harder than anything so far.
So here's where everything finally comes into focus. The part that forces you to rethink what Roman greatness really meant. Because when you zoom out from the individual stories of these boys and look at the bigger system, you start to see a pattern that's way darker than the marble statues and heroic myths we grew up hearing about. Rome didn't just allow this exploitation. It built an entire luxury economy around it. These boys weren't hidden away as embarrassing secrets. They were openly traded, openly displayed, and openly used as symbols of wealth, discipline, and dominance. Their presence in elite homes wasn't considered strange. It was seen as a mark of refinement, a polished house,
a cultivated life, a sign that you'd made it in Roman society. Even the physical alteration of some enslaved boys, something technically outlawed, became part of this quiet, ugly engine turning behind the scenes. Laws existed, sure, but only in theory. In practice, the elite bent them whenever they wanted. Power meant not having to follow your own rules. And the boys caught in this system, they were the ones who paid for that contradiction with their bodies and their futures. But the most heartbreaking part is how invisible they became. These kids lived closer to absolute power than almost anyone else in the empire. They overheard political secrets. They were present during private discussions, personal celebrations, even imperial rituals. They were physically there, but historically silent. No testimonies, no diaries, no recorded words of their own. Just scattered mentions from Roman authors who were more focused on mocking emperors than understanding the lives of the enslaved. They lived surrounded by gold, art, music, and lavish feasts, but none of it belonged to them. They could be admired for their elegance, praised for their obedience, paraded for their beauty, and still have zero control over their own identity. That's the tragedy that sits at the core of their story, the illusion of prestige masking complete powerlessness. And this is the twist that hits hardest, because it forces us to question the glossy version of Rome we were taught. For every triumphal arch and grand Senate speech, there were countless human lives used to prop up that image of greatness. These eunuchs, delicati and peri delicati, were living proof that refinement and cruelty can sit side by side, and Rome never saw a contradiction. But here's the part that really sticks with you, because what happens next pulls everything together and asks a question we still struggle with today.
The trumpet blast cut through the noise like a blade. Every conversation in the forum died instantly. 3 pairs of gladiators stepped forward, their armor glinting like tiny fires under the morning sun. No cheering, no excitement. This wasn't a festival. This was a funeral. They raised their weapons in silence, an ancient gesture to honor the dead man, whose spirit, Romans believed, needed blood to find peace. And then the crowd stepped back. A perfect ring formed around the fighters. Nobles, merchants, beggars, everyone suddenly equal as witnesses to the violence about to begin. The air felt heavier. Nobody smiled. This was not entertainment. It was obligation and dread.
A priest stepped into the ring, lifting a torch smeared with pitch. Its flames snapped in the wind, spitting sparks across the dirt. Every gladiator froze. They knew what came next. The priest lowered the torch toward a small bronze brazier at the center of the arena. When the flame touched it, a column of black smoke spiraled upward, thick, oily, unmistakable. That was the signal, the final, irreversible permission to kill. The crowd murmured a single Latin word under their breath, a word that meant both honor and doom, munus, the duty, the gift, the price. And just like that, the ritual transformed into something far darker. Steel rose, shields tightened. No one could turn back now.
The first pair moved, not with the wild charge you see in movies, but with the slow, cautious steps of men who've survived too many fights. A murmillo, heavy shield locked to his chest, circled a nimble retiarius, armed with nothing but a net and trident, the kind of matchup Romans loved because it felt unfair. Dust curled around their feet. The retiarius flicked his wrist. The net snapped open like a wing. The crowd inhaled sharply. He cast it. A perfect throw, wide, fast, aimed for the kill. But the Marmillo slammed his shield upward, catching the net's weighted edge. The lead balls clanged against bronze. And the same heartbeat, he surged forward,
sword angled low, boots pounding the earth. For a moment, everything blurred, smoke, steel, bodies colliding, and then the sound hit, a sharp, sickening crack of armor splitting. The funeral games had officially begun.
The retiarius stumbled backward, trident scraping across the dirt. Blood dripped from a new gash in his thigh, bright, hot, and very real. The Murmillo pressed the advantage, shield smashing forward like a battering ram. The crowd tensed. They could feel it. This was already spiraling toward a quick, ugly end. But then the retiarius did something desperate. He dropped his trident, not as surrender, but as bait. The Murmillo lunged for the opening, exactly what the net fighter wanted. With a burst of pain-fueled speed, the retiarius swept his leg across the ground, hooking behind the Murmillo's ankle. The heavy armored fighter toppled, a brutal, bone-rattling crash. Gasps rippled through the forum. The retiarius seized his trident again, raised it high, and froze. Because just beyond the Murmillo's helmeted face, he saw them, the priests, watching closely. This was a funeral match. The kill had to be clean, purposeful, ceremonial, not a chaotic street brawl. For a moment, the retiarius hesitated, caught between survival and ritual, and that single moment would decide everything.
The retiarius stood frozen, trident trembling in his hands. Every eye in the forum seemed to pierce him, from the ragged spectators in the back to the senators leaning forward in judgment. This wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a performance of power, tradition, and death all rolled into one. He glanced down at the Murmillo sprawled on the dirt, chest heaving, shield crack. A shiver ran through him, because here's the brutal truth. Whether he won or lost, the crowd didn't care about skill or bravery. They cared about the ritual. They cared about honor. And more than that, they cared about spectacle. Every swing, every stumble, every grunt of pain was measured. A misstep wasn't just a mistake. It was an insult to the memory of the dead man being honored. And that pressure, it was suffocating. He raised his trident again, tighter this time, knuckles white. The Murmillo, slow to rise, caught his gaze. A silent understanding passed between them, both trapped, both part of a deadly theater, neither truly free. The priests circled, murmuring prayers under their breath. A single mistake could mean disfavor, shame, or worse, excommunication from the ritual itself. This was no ordinary fight. It was death choreographed, each movement scrutinized, each outcome a reflection of the empire itself. And just when it seemed like tension couldn't get any higher, something happened that nobody saw coming.
The Murmillo staggered to his feet, blood seeping between the cracks in his armor. The retiarius steadied his grip, muscles coiled, ready to strike again. Then, out of nowhere, a shout rang from the crowd. A senator, tall and imposing, stepped forward, pointing directly at the fighters. The signal was clear. Stop! Confusion swept through the arena. The Murmillo froze mid-lunge. The retiarius blinked. Disbelief etched across his face. The priests murmured, unsure. Spectators leaned in, whispering feverishly. Nobody had expected intervention. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't luck. It was a deliberate political twist. Because in Rome, even funeral games weren't just about honoring the dead. They were a stage for power. Every match, every swing of steel, every gasp from the crowd could be manipulated to send a message. The fighters realized it. This wasn't just a fight. This was a demonstration, a warning, a performance that meant more to the elite than the men on the dirt. And just like that, the momentum shifted. Victory and defeat were no longer in the hands of the gladiators. They were now dictated by invisible strings pulled from the highest tiers of Roman power. But hold on, because what happened next will blow your mind, showing exactly why these games were as much about control as honor.
The crowd held its collective breath. Every eye in the Forum was locked on the fighters, yet nobody could truly act. The match had become bigger than them. It was now about message, hierarchy, and survival in a city obsessed with image. The Mummerlo wiped blood from his brow, realizing the ritual was no longer just about skill. Every step, every block, every strike was being measured not by honor, but by perception. A slip could humiliate not just him, but the senators sponsoring the games. A win could elevate him temporarily. But in reality, both outcomes reinforced the empire's control over life and death. The Retiarius, still trembling, knew the same. He wasn't just fighting an opponent, he was part of a carefully orchestrated display, a living prop in Rome's theater of dominance. Even as his body screamed for instinct, he moved with calculated restraint, blending survival with ritual obedience. Spectators leaned forward, whispers spreading like wildfire. The air was thick, heavy, almost unbearable, and in that tension, the true nature of Roman power became crystal clear. It wasn't the emperor's edicts alone, or the senators' votes, or the armies that conquered distant lands. It was control over the most intimate and terrifying aspects of life, over human bodies, identities, and destinies. The games weren't just honoring the dead, they were teaching the living a lesson. In Rome, even visibility didn't equal freedom. You could sit in golden halls, wield weapons, or command attention, yet the empire's invisible hand could still dictate your every move. And as the final clash approached, every spectator and every gladiator understood this was a performance designed to awe, terrify, and reinforce power all at once.
As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the Forum, the games finally drew to a close. The dust settled. The fighters, battered and bloodied, bowed to the priests and the watching elite, their performance complete. But here's the part most people miss. The true story didn't end with victory or death in the arena. It lived in the quiet aftermath. The boys, the slaves, the delicati, the eunuchs, those whose names barely survived history. They returned to marble halls, gilded cages, and invisible chains. They had seen the empire's grandeur up close, felt its power press down on their bodies, and understood its rules without ever speaking a word. Sporus, the delicatus in Nero's circle, became a symbol of this paradox, admired, displayed, yet utterly voiceless. The imperial court thrived on control, beauty, and spectacle, while hiding cruelty behind ritual, art, and law. These youths embodied Rome's contradictions, refinement alongside exploitation, visibility alongside powerlessness. Their lives were lessons written in flesh and shadow, showing how the empire's greatness often came at the expense of the most vulnerable. And when you think about it, the question Juvenal asked so long ago still resonates today. Quis custodiet ipsis custodes? Who will guard the guards themselves? The empire might have been magnificent, but for the delicati, the spontanes, the pueri delicati, their story was one of hidden suffering, quiet endurance, and a legacy that forces us to reconsider what glory really costs.